Hey y'all, welcome back to US History class. So this week, as I mentioned in person just yesterday, we're going to wrap up this unit with a lesson on the Roaring Twenties and the Harlem Renaissance. This is a super interesting moment in US history, and although I'm really sad we can't learn about this together, I do hope you take something away from this lecture or something you find interesting, something that you can do some research on in your own time. Okay? So as always, let's go ahead and begin with our objective and our agenda. Don't forget to complete the reading and upload your answers on a separate sheet of paper to the proper location on Google Classroom for this Friday at 11:59. Okay? You'll also notice that I added a discussion assignment. This doesn't add a ton of work to you guys, and I think it's a great opportunity to get our thoughts out about some wonderful writing with one another. All that being said, let's go ahead and get into our lecture for this week. First and foremost, I want us to understand that the 1920s is sort of a complicated and somewhat contradictory time. Fresh after our win in World War I, after which our President Wilson advocated for the independence of small nations and for an end to imperialism, the US decides to enter an era of isolation. This is going to have implications for World War II later on. Likewise, after all the reforms against corruption and mistreatment against the nation's poor that we saw during the Progressive Era, things like settlement houses, things like muckrakers, things like the social gospel, this era is matched with a wave of conservatism. In regards to societal changes, both Black Americans and American women take on new responsibilities during World War I, and therefore expect more equal treatment moving forward. We're going to see more of focus on African Americans in the next video, but this one we're going to talk about women for a little bit. But first, in the 1920s, three Republican presidents that dominated the decade supported a hands-off approach to the economy. This is called laissez-faire, a French term basically meaning without interference. This was a turn away from the progressive ideas that the government should have a role in actively caring for the poor that we saw a little bit earlier in the progressive era. These men believed that the government should remove any barriers for the wealthy to make more money. Eventually, the wealthy will provide for the poor with better jobs and better payment and things like that. So, moving on to women. Women took a very different role during World War I than they were usually accustomed to in society. Not only did they serve as nurses, but like we saw in our propaganda posters, but they also stepped up to fill positions in factories, not only producing necessities like clothing, but also manufacturing things like weapons or vehicles needed in combat. The way that women stepped up wasn't only absolutely necessary, but it's quite amazing, really. Imagine changing your entire lifestyle completely in a moment's notice. Now, because they recognized how important this was, how much they contributed, they expected much more equal treatment after the war. To a certain extent, they really took it for themselves. After a long battle, which we've mentioned before, women finally received the right to vote in 1920 with the passing of the 19th Amendment. That's really key. In addition to gaining more political liberty, women began to have different behaviors and societal norms and expectations in the 1920s. They began to wear more risque clothing, they took up smoking, and even added feminine flares to things that were typically considered masculine. So, finally, as business boomed in the 1920s, partially due to lack of government regulation that we just talked about, and partially due to illegal market operations like prohibition, people had enough extra cash to spend on entertainment. Unlike ever before, places like nightclubs, jazz lounges, and speakeasies became really popular and were visited with great frequency to hear musicians like Louis Armstrong, who you can see on the screen here. Likewise, this is the point in US history where baseball emerged as our national pastime, meaning our most popular sport. While most textbooks focus on heroes like Babe Ruth, I want to point your attention to equally, if not more talented, Negro League legends, people like Josh Gibson, or Satchel Paige, or Cool Papa Bell. I highly recommend looking up the history of the Negro Leagues in Latin America if you have some spare time. They went and played in places like the Caribbean or in Mexico, and it's a really, really, really cool history. So, that's it for this video, and we're going to continue our lesson with another video on the Harlem Renaissance. I'll see you then.